What they did to Mary, Queen of Scots, before her execution, was not merely an act of state. It was a slow and calculated descent into darkness, a choreography of humiliation, silence, and power in which every gesture carried the weight of a sentence, and every glance held the promise of the blade that had not yet fallen. And while the cold of the Fotheringhay stones crept up their feet, and the air smelled of old wax and iron, history held its breath. If you are fascinated by dark stories, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from, because what begins now demands witnesses who do not look away. Mary Stuart was not born for that silence. She was born for the sound of French bells and the shimmer of tapestries. Crowned as a child, molded to reign in halls where power was dressed in silk, and yet there she was, in February 1587, not as queen, but as a prisoner, reduced to a watched body, an inconvenient presence that needed to be erased methodically, for Elizabethan England feared both blood and symbolism. And Mary was both legitimate blood and a dangerous symbol. Catholic and Protestant, lands a possible heiress in a kingdom that thrived on conspiracies, and for 19 years they kept her spun from castle to castle like a secret that could neither die nor live until the decision was made. And the ritual began long before the axe was sharpened. The first blow wasn't physical, it was legal. The cold reading of accusations of treason based on deciphered letters, discussed by men who had never felt the weight of a throne on their shoulders. And when the verdict arrived, it wasn't announced like thunder, but like a whisper that spread through the corridors. Guards changing shifts with a new gravity, servants removed, doors closed with an almost religious solemnity, because the state knew that killing a queen required more than force. It required theater, and theater begins by stripping the character of everything that makes them larger than the audience. Then came the official visits, commissions of men in black, wax seals, parchments that creaked as they were unrolled, and each word was a wedge between Mary and the world she knew, informing her that she would have no Catholic priest, that she could not freely write final letters, that her servants would be interrogated, separated, pressured in there. Fear wasn't a scream, it was a constant pressure behind her eyes, the awareness that each small right denied was a rehearsal for the end. The jewels were collected not as objects, but as torn memories. Pearls that had touched her skin at distant parties, rings with coats of arms now considered affront. Even the small crucifix was viewed with suspicion, because symbols are weapons when faith divides kingdoms. And Maria understood this better than anyone, feeling the loneliness grow as the room became more bare, more functional, more like an antechamber to something irrevocable. The guards changed unfamiliar faces, less courtesy, more vigilance, the sound of boots in the corridor, marking time like a macabre clock. And at night, when the candle flickered, she could hear the castle breathe, creaking wood, distant chains, the wind piercing through cracks like an ancient lament. And in this environment, the past was not comfort. It was torment, because it reminded her of everything that was being deliberately taken away. There was the formal reading of the sentence, an act that did not seek to inform but to subdue, carried out before chosen witnesses' words, carefully pronounced to appear legal, inevitable, and Mary responded with trained dignity, citing her status as anointed queen, refusing to acknowledge the authority of the English court over her life. And at that moment, the essential conflict was exposed. It was not just a woman who would be killed, it was the idea of Fotheringhay being tested by the fear of the future. After that, the invisible preparations began. Those that do not appear in official records in detail, because they belong to the gray area of custom and convenience. The checking of the room, the counting of steps to the hall, the discussion about who would be present, about how to control the reaction of the people. And while this was happening, Mary was subjected to a regime of waiting that corroded more than any chain. Days in which nothing happened and everything meant something. Silence as a tool, uncertainty as punishment. She prepared herself in her own way, arranging dark clothes that spoke of mourning and faith, choosing colors that carried messages, the red of martyrdom hidden beneath the black of resignation. Each decision a final assertion of control. And yet, even in these gestures, English authority intervened, approving, vetoing, supervising, because even the manner of dying needed to be managed. The fear that was building was not just the fear of death, it was the fear of ultimate disrespect, of being treated as less than she had been. And this fear fed on rumors whispered by the remaining servants. Stories of how important prisoners were prepared, examined, deprived, and Maria, experienced in politics, knew how to read between the lines. She sensed that something beyond the obvious was being organized, something that needed to happen out of sight, a silent procedure that would ensure that, when the axe fell, nothing would remain that could become a relic. A dangerous myth. The castle seemed complicit, its thick walls muffling any echo of protest, and with each dawn the gray sky seemed lower, as if the world were bowing too. Watch and Maria walked slowly through the permitted space, touching the wood, the rough fabric of the curtains, memorizing sensations, because when the body is about to be taken, memory becomes a last free territory. There were no screams, no open violence. There was a cold discipline that made everything more terrible, the forced normality of simple meals, of measured conversations, of prayers, set under surveillance. And in this climate, the horror did not need to announce itself. It infiltrated, transforming each small act into an omen. And then came the women appointed by the crown, not ladies in waiting chosen by her, but foreign bodies, entrusted with a specific task, observed by officials who pretended to look elsewhere while recording every movement. Because before the public execution there was a private procedure that was not in the official records, but was known in the circles of power. The need to reduce the queen to a manageable, verifiable body, stripped of any element that could generate doubt, scandal, or subsequent veneration. Maria was informed that this was a legal requirement, that it was done for security reasons, that there was no alternative, and the words were soft, almost pulite. But the content was brutal. She was to be examined, measured, searched, not as a sovereign, but as a condemned woman, because the state needed to be sure that there were no tricks, poisons, hidden relics, final messages sewn into fabrics, and above all, it needed to affirm, in that closed space, that the queen's body now belonged to the power that had condemned her. The hands that touched her clothes were not reverent, they were methodical. Cold fingers running over seams, folds, layers of fabric that had been chosen with symbolic care, and each touch was a silent violation, not sexual, but political. A reminder that her autonomy had been broken piece by piece over the years of captivity. When they asked her to remove her cloak, the gesture carried more than practicality. It carried the intention of stripping away the image, and Maria felt a blush rise not from personal shame, but from historical awareness, because she knew that this moment would never be described in books, but would shape everything that would come after. And yet she remained erect, breathing slowly, mentally observing every detail as if she were recording an invisible testimony. The women examined her body with almost clinical attention, searching for marks, objects, anything that could be interpreted as an attempt to manipulate death, and the officers observed not out of curiosity, but to ensure that nothing would escape control, because a real execution needed to be clean, not in the human sense, but in the symbolic one, with no room for doubt, no margin for unplanned martyrdom. There was also the religious weight, because Mary was Catholic, and England feared that even her corpse could become the focus of worship. And so the ritual included the removal of certain devotional objects, small fabrics touched by priests, discreet metals, blessed threads, earthing, noted, collected, sealed, not for return, but for disappearance. Each item removed was like tearing away a layer of identity, leaving only the essential, that which the state would allow to be seen. The silence during the procedure was oppressive, broken only by the sound of fabric being folded, the slight scraping of a bench. Mary's restrained breathing as she felt time distorting each second, stretching out as if the castle itself wanted to witness it. Their fear took on a different form, not the fear of the axe, but the fear of being completely understood by the enemy, of having her intimacy transformed into evidence, into a checklist, into confirmation that nothing remained beyond the reach of power. When they finished, there was no apology, only the practical confirmation that everything was as expected, and that was perhaps the most disturbing thing, because it revealed how normalized and repetitive that ritual was. Part of a system that knew exactly how to erase inconvenient figures without leaving inconvenient traces. Then came the stage that few accounts mention, the forced psychological preparation, a conversation conducted by men who claimed to represent reason and law, explaining how the execution would take place, how many blows would be necessary, where she should position herself, what was expected of her behavior, all said as if it were a technical rehearsal. Maria realized that this wasn't to help her, but to mold her, to ensure that even her final reaction was within an acceptable script. This meticulous description wasn't common for all condemned prisoners, but Maria was no ordinary prisoner, and the fear of improvisation was too great, because an unexpected gesture, a poorly chosen word, could ignite Kunsit, and so every detail was anticipated, explained, devoid of surprise. As she listened, Maria felt a strange clarity settle in, a bitter lucidity, understanding that this ritual existed because power fears chaos more than injustice, and that by controlling every aspect of death, the state was trying to convince itself that it still governed the future. She answered calmly, questioning only what was necessary, affirming her faith, refusing to accept. Protestant ministers in this refusal was also recorded, catalogued as part of the process, because even resistance needed to be documented so as not to escape the official narrative. When she was finally alone again, the room seemed smaller, as if the walls had moved a few centimeters forward, and Maria felt a profound weariness that did not come from her body, but from her soul, an exhaustion of someone who had been analyzed, measured, and deemed ready for disposal. And in this state she knelt, not out of submission to the power that had condemned her, but out of fidelity to something that still belonged to her. Her conscience, her history, her interpretation of the world. The ritual had ended without applause, without external witnesses, without poetic record, and precisely for that reason it was so effective, because it transformed the public execution into a mere final formality, the visible spectacle of a violence that had already occurred in silence. And Maria, upon rising, was no longer just a condemned queen. She was someone who had crossed the invisible boundary between person and controlled symbol, carrying within herself the mark of a process designed never to be remembered. And at that moment, she understood that surviving that ritual emotionally was impossible, but that resisting meant remembering, even if no one else did. And this awareness accompanied her like a shadow until the moment when the doors would open again, now to the world. After that silent ritual, nothing was ever exactly the same again, because the consequences manifested not only in the body that would walk to the scaffold, but in the way Maria came to inhabit her own time, as if each step were now observed by a future story that did not yet exist. Emotionally, she carried a strange serenity, not of full acceptance, but of someone who had already been traversed by the worst kind of violence, the kind that leaves no visible marks, and therefore the public execution that would follow seemed almost redundant, a predictable epilogue to something that was already consummated. Legally, the ritual had fulfilled its function with cold precision, eliminating any possibility of subsequent contestation, ensuring that no sacred object could be used as proof of sanctity, that no bodily ambiguity would fuel rumors, and thus the English state protected itself, not only in the present but in the future, anticipating narratives, shaping interpretations, closing symbolic gaps with the same efficiency with which it had closed doors and windows on that silent morning. Socially, the impact was immediate, albeit invisible, because the few who knew of the procedure carried with them an uncomfortable weight of tacit understanding that power could extend beyond what was publicly declared, and this knowledge eroded trust, fueled fear, reinforced obedience, for if even an anointed queen could be reduced to an examined and administered body, no one was truly beyond reach. Mary, for her part, walked towards the final day with a posture that many would later describe as dignified, courageous, almost theatrical, but few understood that this composure was not born solely from faith or royal education, but from the inner transformation brought about by the hidden ritual, because after being stripped of everything in silence, the public gaze no longer held the same power and she could face the crowd, The officials, the acts, with a kind of inner distance, like someone who had already been separated from the common world. When the blade fell and the blood touched the ground, the spectacle fulfilled its immediate function, eliminating a concrete political threat. But the consequences extended far beyond that, because Maria's death did not end her influence. It only displaced it, transforming her into a narrative, a martyr for some, a warning for others. And it was precisely at this point that the preceding ritual fulfilled its deepest role, ensuring that memory could be controlled, filtered, edited. In official records, there is talk of a necessary execution, of a legal process, of a queen who died bravely. But what happened before is rarely mentioned, because admitting that procedure would mean exposing the inner workings of power, revealing that justice was not limited to sentences, but included carefully thought-out dehumanizing practices. Over the decades, historians have debated letters, conspiracies, religious motivations, but the ritual remained on the margins, vaguely cited, when cited at all, because it did not easily fit into the narrative of legal progress. That England wanted to construct a narrative in which the modern state emerged as rational and restrained, not as invasive and symbolically cruel. This historical distortion occurred not only through forgetfulness, but also through convenience, because fully acknowledging that ritual would require admitting that the transition to modernity was tainted by practices more reminiscent of the liturgy of fear than enlightened justice. And so history preferred to soften, reduce, and transform the horror into a secondary detail. Culturally, Mary's death marked a turning point, reinforcing the idea that sovereign power could be challenged and destroyed, but also that this power was willing to go to the ultimate consequences to protect itself, and this precedent echoed in future generations, shaping the relationship between rulers and the ruled, between faith and state, between body and authority. For Maria, even though her life ended in that cold room, the ritual accompanied her beyond death, influencing how she was remembered, venerated, or discarded according to the political context. Ironically, in attempting to erase certain aspects, the powerful ended up creating a void that the collective imagination filled with even more force, because what is hidden tends to take on mythical contours. The silence imposed before the execution became part of the shadow that surrounds her name, a shadow that persists, because it speaks less about Maria and more about those who decided how she should disappear. Looking at this episode today, one realizes that the true violence was not just the final blow, but the entire process that taught the world that absolute control is not exercised only in visible death, but in the invisible preparation that precedes the end. And perhaps that's why this story still disturbs us, because it reveals that civilization advances not only through lofty ideals, but also through hidden rituals that we prefer not to confront. And when we remember Mary, Queen of Scots, not as a statue or an idealized martyr, but as a woman traversed by a system that needed to destroy her in silence before doing so publicly, we are forced to recognize that the true horror is rarely in the final moment, but in what is done when they believe no one is watching. After everything was officially over, after the blood was cleaned from the floor and the hall was once again nothing but stone and shadow, there was still one last, discreet, almost imperceptible movement that definitively sealed Maria's fate. Because power is rarely satisfied with visible death, it needs to ensure that nothing survives outside its reach. And so far from the eyes of the people, the final stage of erasure began, a silent process conducted by men who wielded not axes but pens, keys, and verbal orders, tasked with organizing what remained not of the body but of the meaning. The belongings collected before the execution were silently sorted, cataloged without emotion. Some burned, others kept in vaults that no one would ever open again, because each fragment carried the threat of becoming a relic, and a relic has the power to challenge entire states. Meanwhile, Mary's body was treated not as that of a queen, but as a sensitive object, something that needed to be symbolically neutralized, wrapped, sealed, transported under surveillance, because even the way the dead are handled can ignite there was no public wake worthy of her position, no space for collective mourning. And this absence was deliberate, a political choice that transformed silence into a tool, because shared grief creates memory, and memory creates continuity, something the English crown could not allow at that fragile moment of religious and successional balance. Instead, the narrative began to be carefully shaped. Official letters sent to allies, measured explanations, legal justifications, repeated until they sounded natural, and little by little the horror was diluted in bureaucratic language, transformed into necessity, duty, and inevitable act, while what could not be explained was simply omitted. The surviving servants were dispersed, some rewarded, others warned, all instructed to forget, because forgetting can also be imposed when there is sufficient power, and so the direct witnesses of the ritual prior to the execution were swallowed up by ordinary life, carrying within themselves images that had no place in official discourses. Over the years, Maria came to exist more as an idea than as a person, sometimes a villainous conspirator, sometimes an unjustly wronged martyr, according to the political winds. And in this process, what really happened to her was fragmented, softened, reinterpreted, until the hidden ritual became an academic whisper, an uncomfortable footnote that many preferred not to develop. However, the effect of that final procedure resonated more deeply than its executors imagined, because by transforming a queen into an administrative object until the very last second, the state revealed a truth that would transcend the centuries, that modernity was not born solely from enlightened ideas, but also from cold mechanisms of control, from practices designed to domesticate collective fear through example. The death of Mary taught future rulers that it was not enough to eliminate the enemy. It was necessary to manage their memory. This lesson was applied repeatedly throughout history, in carefully staged public trials, in extracted confessions, in legal rituals that concealed profound symbolic violence, and thus, even unknowingly, Mary became a silent landmark in the evolution of institutionalized repression. For those who, centuries later, tried to reconstruct her story, the void left by the erasure became a minefield of interpretations, because where records are lacking, myths arise, and where myths arise, truth becomes unstable. Yet, by looking closely at what remains truncated letters, contradictory accounts, strategic silences, it is possible to feel the presence of that last ritual as a constant shadow, an absence that speaks louder than any explicit description. The final part of what they did to Mary was not just burying her far from her people, but burying her under layers of convenient narrative, transforming a sequence of calculated acts into an almost abstract ending. And this was perhaps the most enduring violence, because it robbed her not only of her life, but also of the right to be fully understood. Even today, when her name is mentioned, one rarely imagines what that final period truly meant: the feeling of being observed, measured, reduced, prepared like a problem to be solved. And in revisiting this aspect, not as a scandal but as an essential part of history, something uncomfortable emerges. The realization that horror is not only found in times considered barbaric, but also in moments when power learns to act with excessive efficiency. Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed on a cold February day, but what they did to her before that continues to reverberate because it reveals a mechanism we still recognize. Systems that claim to be just while operating in silence, that legitimize themselves by erasing traces that survive not only through force, but through the ability to control what will be remembered. And perhaps that is why her story insists on returning, because as long as there are structures that need to be destroyed in secret before punishing in public, the ghost of that ritual will continue to walk with us, reminding us that the true end does not happen when the blade falls, but when we comfortably believe that everything that needed to be said has already been said.